The bitter dust of the Judean road had settled over everything. The linen shrouds, the wooden lintel of the doorway, and most profoundly, the very air inside Elara's lungs. It had been 7 days since Mathias was taken by the fever, swift and brutal like a desert storm. 7 days since the world, which had been perfectly organized and humming with quiet joy, had been violently silenced. Elara did not weep anymore. The deep well of tears had run dry, leaving behind only grit and the sharp, aching edge of fury. Fury, not at the fever, but at the profound, deafening silence that followed the prayers. She sat rigidly on the low stool, her back pressed against the cold stone wall, observing the room where his tools still lay, where the scent of his leatherwork lingered, mocking her with its permanence. People came, the kind women of the village, the elder Benanan offering carefully chosen verses from the Psalms, her own distraught mother, but Elara heard them as if they spoke from underwater, their voices muffled, their platitudes meaningless. They spoke of God's plan, of the cycle of life, of hope beyond the veil, but Elara only felt the yawning chasm of now. Her husband, Mathias, a man whose hands were gentle enough to braid her hair and strong enough to haul the fishing nets, was gone, not merely departed, but erased. The space he occupied was an impossible void. She found herself obsessively cataloguing the objects he had touched in the last hours, trying to anchor her sanity to tangible proof of his existence. Yet each item only served as a chisel, chipping away at her remaining composure. The terracotta cup he drank from, chipped at the rim, felt suddenly alien, cold and heavy. The sandals he had kicked off by the door, still slightly damp from the morning dew, were now monuments to a journey that had stopped short. This grief was not a smooth river to be navigated. It was a sudden collapse, a mountain falling into the sea, leaving her stranded on a fractured shore. She had always believed in the promise of peace, the comfort found in the law and the prophets, the steady hand of the Almighty guiding the ship of her life. But when the storm hit, the hand was nowhere to be found, and the ship was dashed to pieces. This was not the gentle chastisement she had learned about. This was annihilation. Her mind raced, a chaotic swarm of why and if only, circling the impossible realization that the shared future they had woven together, thread by careful thread, was now just a pile of shredded linen. She remembered their last conversation, mundane and sweet, about the price of olives at the market, and the cruelty of that small, ordinary memory was unbearable. How could such a vital, vibrant life dissolve into nothingness while the olives still grew green on the branch? The promises she had clung to felt like paper in the fire. They offered hope, but hope demanded a strength she no longer possessed, a willingness to look forward when all her energy was spent looking back at the smoking ruins of her past. She wished, truly wished, for the earth to open up and claim her too, if only to silence the screaming absence in her soul. This was the raw, unvarnished face of grief. Not noble sorrow, but grinding, desperate, exhausting despair. The sun rose the 8th day, and Elara found herself trapped in the terrible clarity of continuing existence. Grief had stripped the world of its comforting ambiguity. There was no good morning, only the morning itself, demanding she rise and breathe and put one foot in front of the other. She tried to re-establish the rhythm of the household, a desperate attempt to prove that the world was still sane. She fetched water from the well, the copper bucket rattling against the stone lip, a sound that in her former life would have signaled the start of a productive day. Now the sound was an accusation. Every task was a deliberate act of defiance against the crushing weight of absence. She kneaded the dough for the morning bread, her knuckles white against the flour. But when she reached for the spice box, she paused. Mathias always loved a pinch of cumin in the bread. The simple muscle memory of reaching for the spice transformed into a paralyzing moment of realization. The future held no more shared tastes, no more small concessions to his preferences. The bread was baked in silence, and it tasted like ash. She attempted to mend a tear in his favorite tunic, a deep blue garment he wore for the Sabbath. As the needle pierced the fabric, she felt a profound surge of tenderness mixed with revulsion. The smell of him still clung faintly to the woven threads, a ghost scent that promised intimacy and delivered only isolation. She cast the garment aside, unable to finish the work, knowing that mending it felt like preparing it for someone else, or worse, acknowledging its final uselessness. The women of the village, sensing her retreat, tried to involve her in their tasks, shelling beans, preparing for the upcoming harvest festival. They meant well, their voices soft, their eyes full of pity. But pity was the last thing Elara could bear. Titi acknowledged her brokenness, and she desperately wanted to appear whole, even if that wholeness was a brittle, painted facade. She found herself navigating conversations with cold, precise answers, driving wedges of silence between herself and anyone who dared approach too closely. She realized that the greatest terror was the loss of memory, the fear that the sharp edges of his voice, or the exact way his eyes crinkled when he laughed, would dull over time. So she began to deliberately starve her mind of new input, refusing to engage with the present, dedicating every waking moment to reviewing the archive of their life together, fearing that any distraction would allow a vital detail to slip away forever. She ate sparingly, slept less, and lived entirely within the confines of her memory, a beautifully furnished prison from which there seemed no escape. The external world continued its relentless motion, the calls of the marketplace, the distant bleating of sheep, the children's laughter echoing down the street. But for Elara, time had stopped the moment Mathias drew his last breath. Her life had become a relentless, empty routine, a theater performance where the leading actor had left the stage, leaving the supporting cast to wander aimlessly among the props, waiting for a final curtain that never fell. The neighbors, good people steeped in generations of tradition, eventually realized that quiet meals and shared silence were insufficient for Elara's brand of grief. They decided intervention was necessary, guided by the wisdom of the elders. They brought counsel, the codified, structured comfort of their faith, designed to shepherd the mourner back into the fold of the living. First came old Rabbi Simeon, a man whose beard smelled of aged parchment and incense. He spoke gently of Abraham, reminding Elara that all life is a pilgrimage, and that death is merely the final, necessary turn in the road back to the Father. He cited the book of Job, emphasizing endurance and the inexplicable sovereignty of God. "Our finite minds cannot grasp the infinite tapestry," Simeon whispered, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "But we are assured that the thread of Mathias's life is now woven into the eternal design." Elara listened, not with rebellion, but with a chilling detachment. The words were beautiful, theologically sound, but they landed on her heart like pebbles on ice, failing to break the surface. Simeon's wisdom addressed the cosmic scale of suffering, yet Elara's grief was intensely personal, measured in the empty space beside her in the bed, not in parables of creation. His counsel felt abstract, distant, a magnificent cathedral built miles away from the small ruined house where she lived. Then came the women, bringing practical advice framed in spiritual duty. They spoke of the need for purification, for the cleansing rituals, for returning to the synagogue to find strength in communal prayer. "You must not let the enemy seize this sorrow," urged Miriam, a woman who had herself buried 2 infant sons. "The Lord requires your strength, Elara. He does not want you to languish in self-pity. You honor Mathias by choosing life." The phrase, "choosing life," grated against her raw nerves. How could she choose life when the only life she desired was impossible? She didn't feel self-pity. She felt a righteous indignation that her perfect small universe had been carelessly destroyed. The collective weight of their expectations, that she should move through the prescribed stages of mourning, that she should accept the mystery, that she should find comfort in the well-worn phrases of their faith, became suffocating. She realized that their comfort was conditioned on her conformity. They were seeking to heal their own unease by seeing her progress. This realization pushed her further away. She politely thanked them, meticulously folding the linen they brought, arranging the jars of oil they offered, but inwardly she was constructing a wall of ice. The traditional comfort failed because it demanded explanation where there was only chaos, demanded rational acceptance where the only honest response was visceral rage. The rituals of mourning, meant to provide structure and grounding, felt like chains binding her to a reality she wished to escape. If the ancient covenant meant that goodness offered no protection against random devastation, and that her only recourse was silent acceptance, then she felt bitterly betrayed by the very foundation of her existence. She felt the irresistible urge to flee, to find a place where the air was not thick with expectation, where the silence was not constantly being assaulted by the kind, empty noise of human reassurance. The decision, when it came, was less a conscious choice and more a sudden, visceral need for physical space. Elara needed to breathe air that hadn't been filtered through the pitying eyes of her community. She took the donkey, laden with a few sacks of dried figs, water skins, and 2 worn blankets, and headed east, toward the barren slopes that led up to the high desert plateau. She did not know her destination, only that it needed to be far from the familiar scent of wood smoke and the sound of the evening call to prayer. She eventually found an abandoned shepherd's enclosure, a rough ring of stones offering minimal shelter but maximum solitude. It was precisely what she needed, a place where the landscape was as desolate as her heart, where the vast, empty sky did not judge her failure to cope. Here, her spiritual crisis deepened into a cold, hard certainty. She was not merely grieving, she was wrestling with God Himself, and she was losing. Her internal dialogue became a relentless stream of accusations. If he is all-powerful, why did he allow the fever to take him? If he is love, why did he leave me with this unbearable void? The silence of the desert amplified her questioning, giving her nothing back but the whistling wind. She tried to pray, lifting her eyes to the indifferent blue, but the words withered on her tongue. Prayer felt like begging a tyrant for mercy, or worse, conversing with an empty room. This isolation forced her to confront the core lie she felt she had been told, that faith guaranteed protection, or at least understanding. She had been a dutiful daughter of Israel, keeping the Sabbath holy, performing the duties of her house with diligence, living a life of quiet charity. Her reward, it seemed, was the shattering of her greatest earthly treasure. This was the moment she actively chose unbelief, not in the existence of the divine, but in his goodness, or, at the minimum, his active involvement in the minute tragedies of human life. She was utterly alone. Yet in this desolation, a perverse kind of freedom began to bloom. She was free from the duty of hope, free from the exhaustion of pretending, free to wallow in the pure, black intensity of her despair. She spent days simply watching the shadows lengthen and retreat across the stones, allowing herself the indulgence of complete surrender to hopelessness. She stopped cleaning the few utensils she had brought. She let her hair fall unbound and dusty around her shoulders. She was seeking the lowest possible point, the absolute rock bottom, believing that only in that extremity could the expectations of comfort finally cease. Yet in her deepest recesses of her despair, a microscopic flicker of her training persisted. She found herself subconsciously humming the ancient melodies of the Sabbath songs, her lips forming the words to the Exodus narrative, even while her mind screamed dissent. The roots of faith, though withered, were proving far deeper than she had imagined, woven into the very fabric of her identity, stubbornly refusing to allow complete spiritual death. It was in this internal tension, the screaming rational mind versus the residual persistent soul, that the first faint cracks began to appear in the monolithic wall of her despair. One afternoon, while searching for kindling in a small sheltered alcove near the enclosure, Elara stumbled upon something unexpected. Tucked beneath a loose pile of rubble, perhaps left by a long-gone shepherd, was a fragment of a scroll. It was brittle and yellowed, the edges frayed by time and weather, but the script, though faded, was still legible. It was a partial inscription of a familiar, yet somehow newly resonant psalm, a hymn of desperate trust. The words spoke not of triumphant glory or easy provision, but of God being a refuge in the midst of trouble, a strength when the earth gives way. She traced the worn letters with a dusty fingertip. "Be still and know that I am God." The words were simple, yet they struck her with the force of a physical blow. Her initial reaction was defiance. Be still? How could she be still when every nerve ending was vibrating with pain? No? What did she know but absence and betrayal? She clutched the fragment, the rough parchment digging into her palm, and she argued aloud with the text, her voice harsh and cracked in the silence of the high desert. "You ask me to know you, yet all I know is the empty space where my husband stood. If this is knowledge, then it is the bitterest wisdom of all." She spent hours repeating the phrase, turning it over in her mind, searching for the logical flaw, the escape clause. Why did the scripture not demand she fight or rage or even mourn, but simply be still? This stillness, she realized, was the antithesis of her current life, a life dedicated to the frenetic internal struggle against reality. The passage was not demanding action, it was demanding surrender, a terrifying cessation of the battle she had been waging against the universe. This confrontation with the ancient text forced her to acknowledge the true nature of her coping mechanism. She was not coping at all. She was fighting. She was fighting the silence, fighting the finality, fighting the promise that had failed her. And in that fight, she was exhausting herself into oblivion. The profound weight of the loss remained, but the exhaustion from the resistance began to feel heavier than the grief itself. It begged the question, what if peace wasn't the absence of sorrow, but the cessation of the need to control it? The text seemed to imply that the knowledge of the divine arrived not in moments of clarity or victory, but in moments of utter, desperate stillness. It forced her to consider if her inability to cope stemmed from the belief that she should be able to cope alone, using her own emotional and spiritual resources. The truth was, her resources were bankrupt. The story of her grief had reached a critical inflection point, moving from the purely physical experience of loss to the philosophical inquiry of suffering. This is where the journey of faith always finds its most harrowing path. The decision to trust the shepherd even when the path leads through the darkest valley, when every instinct screams to run back to the ruined pasture. This moment of intellectual and spiritual wrestling is one we all face when the foundation of our life crumbles, forcing us to ask, when profound loss takes everything, is true peace a goal we can actively pursue through sheer will, or is it only a gift granted after the painful struggle of surrender? Have you ever felt that agonizing struggle between fighting grief and finally allowing yourself to surrender to the mystery, however painful? Share your experience in the comments below. Sometimes acknowledging the fight is the first step toward the peace. The answer to Elara's agonizing questions did not arrive in a thunderclap or a blinding vision, but in the quiet, unassuming form of a visitor. Late one evening, just as the last sliver of sun dipped behind the western peaks, throwing the enclosure into deep shadow, a lone figure appeared on the horizon. He moved slowly, deliberately, leading a heavily burdened mule. He introduced himself simply as Jonas, a weaver from the north, traveling south to Jerusalem for the high holy days and seeking shelter for the night. Elara, wary and resistant to company, offered the sparse hospitality of the stone shelter, warning him of its emptiness and her own silent disposition. Jonas accepted her silence as readily as he accepted the handful of figs she offered. He made no mention of her grief, asked no probing questions about her solitude, and offered no scripture or comforting rhetoric. He simply existed alongside her. He tended to his mule, meticulously checking its harness and watering it from the leather pouch. He set about building a small, smokeless fire, his movements practiced and rhythmic. Elara watched him from the shadows, fascinated by his composure, the effortless competence of his presence. His comfort lay not in what he said, but in what he did. He did not try to fix her or her situation. He simply provided a momentary anchor of normalcy in her chaotic existence. The next morning, Jonas did not pack up immediately. He noticed the water skins were low and, without fanfare, took them down the dusty path to the nearest ravine spring, returning an hour later with them full and heavy. He noticed the weakness of the stone wall on the east side, where years of wind had loosened the mortar. He spent the better part of the morning quietly collecting loose stones and carefully resetting them, strengthening the shelter he had only occupied for one night. His labor was a silent parable, the small, deliberate act of mending what was broken, expecting nothing in return. Elara watched, captivated, realizing that this man offered the first genuine comfort she had received since Mathias died. The comfort was not emotional or spiritual, it was physical, practical, and utterly selfless. He acknowledged her humanity by addressing the practical need for shelter and water, respecting her pain by leaving the spiritual void untouched. It was in this simple, shared silence, watching him work, that the crushing weight of her isolation began to subtly lift. The presence of another human being, not demanding she perform mourning or display faith, but simply being present, was an unexpected balm. Jonas's hands, though calloused by the loom, moved with a quiet certainty that reminded her of Mathias's strength, yet without the accompanying agony of memory. When he finally prepared to leave mid-morning, he paused before mounting his mule. He did not offer a blessing or a farewell speech. He merely looked at Elara, his eyes clear and kind, and said, "The journey is long. You are not meant to carry the burdens of the whole world, only the weight of today." And then he was gone, leaving behind not platitudes, but a mended wall, full water skins, and the realization that perhaps true solace arrived in moments of shared, unburdened presence, proving that even a broken soul could still find sustenance in the fundamental generosity of life. Jonas's quiet visit, brief as it was, had left behind a profound shift in Elara's perspective. The mended wall was a tangible reminder that restoration was possible, even if only on a small material scale. She began to reconsider the nature of her memories. Before Jonas, memories of Mathias were weapons, tools used to inflict pain upon herself, proof of her immeasurable loss. Now, watching the sunlight fall on the newly set stones, she felt a subtle change. She began to recall Mathias not in the blinding light of the final agonizing loss, but in the softer glow of gratitude. She remembered the day they had first met, when she was selling pomegranates in the market, and he had laughed at her fierce haggling skills, his eyes full of admiration. She remembered the arduous weeks they spent building their small house, sharing wine and dreams under the fierce summer sun. These memories were still painful, laced with sorrow, but they were no longer purely agonizing. They were evidence of the profound gift she had been given, a covenant of love that, though prematurely severed by death, was not invalidated by it. She started reciting the Psalms again, not as mandatory ritual, but as exploration. She no longer focused on the verses promising prosperity or victory, but on those acknowledging profound distress and dependence. She lingered over the words, "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." She understood for the first time that the promise wasn't the guarantee of a path around the shadow, but the assurance of companionship within it. Her spiritual journey had been derailed because she had confused the covenant with a contract, expecting God to uphold his end by ensuring her perfect happiness. She now realized the covenant was about sustaining her through the deepest pain, offering a continuity of relationship that transcended the brutality of earthly existence. This realization was freeing. She hadn't failed her faith. Her expectation of what faith should do had been too narrow, too self-centered. Her focus shifted from the devastating question of why did this happen to me, to the humbling truth of what did I have and how do I honor that gift now. By focusing on gratitude for the time she was given, the bitter resentment began to recede, replaced by a quiet awe at the intensity of the love she had experienced. She understood that denying the joy she had shared, simply because it ended too soon, was to allow the final tragedy to overshadow the beautiful entirety of their life together. The presence of death had magnified the sweetness of life, forging a new, deeper appreciation for the fleeting nature of all earthly treasures. The peace she sought was not the absence of tears. The tears would come, and justly so, but the ability to cry without losing the underlying foundation of trust. She was still broken, but she was no longer shattered. She was slowly, painstakingly gathering the pieces, understanding that they would never fit perfectly again, but they could be assembled into something new, something scarred but enduring. The journey back to the village was gradual, undertaken not in haste or fear, but with a quiet, measured resolve. Elara didn't rush toward reconciliation with her neighbors. She needed to return on her own terms, anchored by her newfound, if fragile, peace. She chose a market day, the noise and bustle providing a camouflage for her re-entry. The sight of the village, the crowded square, the familiar smells of baking bread and roasting lamb, the high, clear voices of the children was initially overwhelming. She felt like an alien observing a world she once belonged to. She purchased only what was necessary: fresh olives, a small loaf of dark bread, and some oil. As she was leaving the merchant's stall, she saw her. Across the busy square, near the well, sat Leah, a younger woman from the community whose husband, Simon, had left months prior to seek work in Caesarea and had not been heard from since. Leah was weeping, her face buried in her hands, her distress raw and visible. Her tears were quiet, internal, the kind that spoke of chronic anxiety rather than acute shock. Elara hesitated. Her first instinct, honed by months of isolation, was to avert her gaze and hurry home, shielding her own fragile heart. But then she remembered the silence of Jonas, the simple power of his presence. She remembered the pain of receiving abstract platitudes when what she needed was simple, physical acknowledgement. With a deep breath that tasted of dust and acceptance, Elara walked toward the well. She did not offer scripture or promises. She did not speak of the sovereignty of God or the necessity of patience. She simply sat down on the stone coping beside Leah, silently placing the fresh loaf of bread on the ground between them. She reached out and placed her hand, gently but firmly, over Leah's shaking shoulder. She offered no words for several minutes, allowing the noise of the market to wash over their small island of shared sorrow. When Elara finally spoke, her voice was low, rough from disuse, but filled with a depth of empathy she had not possessed before Mathias's death. "The silence is the hardest part," Elara said, avoiding any mention of Simon, any attempt to compare their burdens. The silence convinces you that you are alone, even when the world is full of noise. Leah lifted her head, her eyes red and streaming, but recognizing the absolute authenticity in Elara's gaze. There was no pity there, only kinship. In that moment, Elara realized that her grief, far from being a purely personal curse, had carved out a profound capacity for compassion. She understood now that her experience had not been wasted. It had forged a tool capable of reaching into the depths of another's pain in a way that generalized kindness never could. She spent the next half hour simply listening, offering small sips of water and sharing the bread. She was not a healer or a counselor. She was simply a fellow traveler, scarred by the journey, who could confidently attest that the ground underfoot, though cracked, was still solid enough to stand on. This act of genuine reintegration, not seeking comfort but offering it, was the ultimate proof that the spiritual crisis had passed. By reaching out, she finally severed the chains of self-pity, transforming her suffering from a private burden into a conduit for shared humanity, a necessary step toward true, enduring peace. Elara's reintegration into village life continued with this quiet, grounded authenticity. She returned to her small home, no longer viewing it as a tomb for shared memories, but as a structure that had witnessed and survived the storm. She finished mending Mathias's blue tunic, this time without the paralyzing scent of immediate loss, folding it carefully and placing it in a cedar chest, a dignified memorial rather than a painful reminder. Her relationship with the divine had shifted entirely. It was no longer a relationship based on demand and expectation, but on simple, humble acceptance. She understood that the peace promised by the prophets and the Psalms was not a shield against reality, but a profound state of being that encompassed and transcended reality's brutality. It was the peace that surpasses all understanding, because it did not require the understanding of why the tragedy occurred. It merely required trust in the continuous nature of the good, even when obscured by the immediate bad. One evening, she stood alone on her porch, looking up at the immense, star-dusted velvet of the Judean sky. In the depths of her initial grief, the stars had seemed cold, indifferent, mocking the smallness of her pain. Now she saw them differently. She saw the vast, ordered chaos of creation, the immense scale of existence stretching far beyond the confines of her small, earthly sorrow. This vastness was no longer threatening, it was reassuring. It hinted at a design far grander than she could ever comprehend, a timeline that dwarfed her 80 years, and an ultimate purpose that transcended even death. She accepted that she would never receive a celestial explanation for Mathias's early departure. The answers were simply not available on this side of the veil. And in that acceptance, the need for the answer dissolved. This was the moment of final, true surrender. Surrender was not defeat. It was the ultimate act of trust. It was laying down the heavy shield of her pride and demanding heart, and simply resting in the knowledge that she was held. The aching hole in her life remained. It would always remain. But it was no longer a fresh, bleeding wound. It was a scar, a permanent part of her landscape, a testament to the depth of the love and the pain she had endured. She could look at the empty place beside her and feel the grief, but she could also feel the quiet strength that had carried her through the wilderness. The wisdom she had gained was costly, bought at the price of her shattered past, but it was authentic. She realized that the deepest peace is not found in the cessation of pain, but in the unwavering connection to the source of life, allowing sorrow and strength to coexist in the same heart, finding stillness not by escaping the storm, but by dropping anchor firmly within its eye. The years moved on, measured not by the sorrowful milestones of loss, but by the steady, quiet rhythm of continued existence. Elara became a fixture in the village, known for her quiet strength and the profound empathy she offered to anyone wrestling with tragedy. She never remarried. Her love for Mathias remained a sanctified space in her heart, not a barrier to life, but a foundation of immense depth. She became the woman people sought out when their own codified comforts failed, when the formal platitudes of the synagogue felt hollow. They came to her because she had lived the lie of simple answers and survived. She could sit with them in the wreckage of their lives, not offering facile solutions, but offering the simple assurance that suffering, however annihilating, does not have the final word. She often reflected on the long, brutal journey from the immediacy of the fever to the quiet grace she now possessed. She understood that the Bible's promise of peace was not a magical, instantaneous cure for pain. It was the assurance of a presence and a perspective that would enable one to travel through the pain without being permanently consumed by it. The peace was the divine capacity to grieve deeply, yet stand steadily. It was the sustaining strength found in the covenant, the assurance that the divine never leaves the side of the suffering, even when the suffering feels like absolute abandonment. Her life had become a living parable, demonstrating that the deepest waters of despair, though terrifying, are not inescapable. She learned that coping with profound loss is ultimately an exercise in surrender, surrendering the expectation of control, surrendering the demand for answers, and surrendering the belief that a good life must be a pain-free life. It was through this radical surrender that the peace, the shalom that transcends human understanding, finally flowed in, filling the void not by erasing the memory of Mathias, but by elevating her gratitude for his existence above the agony of his absence. She understood that her strength did not come from her own will, but from the relentless, quiet insistence of the divine presence, carrying her like a child when her legs could no longer move. The Bible's promise wasn't about the removal of the affliction, but the endurance of the afflicted. She found her purpose redefined, to bear witness to the fact that light can and does return, even if the landscape it illuminates is forever changed. This hard-won wisdom, the quiet truth born of ashes, was the most precious treasure of her long life, a testament to the enduring promise of comfort held within the ancient scriptures for every grieving heart, no matter how desperately alone they feel in the dark night of their soul. It is a peace freely offered to those who, exhausted by the fight, finally choose to be still and know the enduring truth of His sustaining love. This ultimate realization became the final true comfort, one that death itself could never steal away.